Hello, welcome to the Mockdoor Getting Started Guide. In this video, we're going to cover creating our first mock. In this video, we're going to cover the full demo in Mockdoor itself, but in that, we're going to cover creating tenants, service group, the microservice, and then the mock itself. We're going to cover creating an automatic mock and a manual mock. So without further ado, let's go to Mockdoor. So the first screen you're going to see will be a tenants overview page, but there won't be any actual tenants. As Mockdoor is multi-tenanted, everything is grouped into tenants, but don't worry, if you don't have a multi-tenanted environment, you can just create a default tenant. For this demo, we don't need multiple tenants, so we will create a default tenant. The first value is name, which is just a user-friendly name. And the next is path, which is used when calling the mock endpoint to know which tenant to call. So for this, we can put a simple one like default. It can't have any special characters, should be short, and should be lowercase. Done that, click create. Next, we need to create a service group, which is like a folder. It can be used to group your services in environments. For example, you could have a local, a K8, and a deployed environment, or you could have a QA and a development, or an Azure, any way that makes sense to you to group your microservices and more. So for this, we'll add, let's create a development. We'll give it a path of dev. These are similar to tenant, where the name is just a user-friendly name and the path is used in the path of the request. The default health check URL is used to do a health check on a general shared route for all of the microservices if you happen to have one. In this case, we don't need to worry about that, so we can leave it and leave it as enabled. Click create. It'll take us back to the tenants overview. From here, we can click manage on the service group at the top right. And then we can click new microservice in the top right again, because we're going to create a new microservice that we're going to be mocking. We don't have real microservices, so for this demo, we're going to use JSON placeholder, which is a public free to use API. And we'll give it a path of JSONP. The target URL domain is to point to the real microservice or API you're going to be mocking or testing. So in this case, it's going to be JSON placeholder. We can put that here. If you don't have a microservice yet and you just want to mock, you can just leave this blank, or if you don't want to train off real data, again, you can leave this blank. We'll leave some of these other settings for another video, but an important one to note is the headers. So if you're working with a microservice that requires authorization, it's important to remember to set an authorization header to be passed through. So this is saying user-defined headers will be passed through on forwarding the request, but not necessarily in the response. That's the typical setup. We don't need that in this case, so I'll remove that. Proxy mode says requests to Mockdoor will proxy them to the real service. So this only works when you have a target domain set. We're going to train off of real API, so we will leave that as enabled, and these other settings will be covered in another video. So we can click create. We now have everything set up we need in order to actually run a test. You can get to the built-in Mockdoor API testing page through Tools and Mock Tester, but just to show a convenient alternative way to get to that, you can go to Edit for the microservice by clicking the Edit button, and then in the top right there is a Test button that allows you to jump straight to testing that particular microservice. So JSON placeholder has an API under Post. So we can see here the target endpoint. It shows that the domain it's going to be sent to, and then posts is the endpoint we're entering. Next important thing to see is the mock endpoint. So this is the endpoint that you would put in your UI or service that's going to be making these requests, and you want to receive the mock data. all mock endpoints have the option to change the order of the parameters. So this is currently at tenant, group, and microservice. T for tenant, G for group, and M for microservice. It can be useful to put tenant on the end so that you can pass the tenant through in different scenarios. And once you've got that in the order you want, you can right click and copy the URL. There's a convenient way to get the URL and put it into your microservice. So we can now click run test. And we can see that ran a test calling Mockdoor, and the result got proxied to the real API. We can see down here it was a 200 with a large JSON body and a latency of 155. That should be low. I'm running in development mode now, so it's a little bit slow. We can click view results at the top right to see the result here. See the result has come through and automatically been populated. So that's our first mock created, the automatic, which is very, very simple. But we can also add more. So if we want to add a manual mock, we can go back to the home, manage for the group, and then on the microservice, we can click edit. And at the bottom, we can click add request. And here, this is like an endpoint that you want to listen to and return mock responses from. So we could make this a mock endpoint /endpoint. We won't set query parameters or headers or a custom body to listen to, but we can say it must be an exact URL match, and it's only for GET requests. We're not worried about authorization headers, but this would return a 401 if the authorization header was missing. And we want to set it to mock only, as the API doesn't actually exist, but it won't try and create mock data for it. And we now click create. We're now on the edit page for that same request, and we can scroll down and click add response. This is where you add the actual response. You can give it a custom description to make it easier, but we don't need to do that, so we will leave that for now. And we will set a mock response. It can be anything you want, doesn't have to be JSON. And just to make it clear to the listener, this is a application JSON response. We can set the encoding priority is something we covered in another video. So we'll just click create. This endpoint now exists with one predefined mock response. We can now go to the mock tester top. When accessing it this way, we need to select the tenant, the group, and the microservice manually at the top. Now, if we were to call the mock endpoint now, we need to remember that this is proxying to the real service, which there is no endpoint called a mock endpoint. So we would get back a 404. If we want to get back our mock result, there are a few ways. One is to turn off proxy mode, so that it will only ever return responses from the mock data that's available. And now we can go a mock endpoint, run test. We can see it's returned our mock data. Another way you can test this would be to turn the proxy back on, but we can go to the results, click on a mock endpoint, and there's an option here to set it as the current response. That means that even during proxy mode, this is the response that will always be returned. So we can now go back to the testing page. There's a useful button for this. On the requests line, right at the end, there is a test button that will take you to the page pre-populated to run that endpoint. Now if we hit run test, we get back our mock data even though it's set to proxy. And finally, just to show that the mock data from the automatic works, we can go to view here. We can edit this data. We would change it to test and save. If we now go back to test this, it's still in proxy mode and we haven't told it to simulate this particular response. So if we call, we will see we get the real API data back. We go to our view results. We will see under post that we have the one we edited and another copy of the real response data. This is because Mockdoor keeps track of all responses that are unique. So when calling the real API, it created a new row. But now we could click set response as current response here. The most recent response will generally be returned. So in order to demonstrate this, we'll set this as the current response. And we'll go back to test. Hit run again, and we get back our mock data. So in this video, we managed to cover creating our tenant, our service group, and a microservice, and then creating an automatic mock and a manual mock. Again, if you want to follow along, you can follow the wiki, which covers all the steps we just covered and includes covering how you test your mocks, which we also covered. So thank you for watching the Getting Started guide. More guides are to come. Just to close off, if you want to know more about Mockdoor, you can go to the official website at mymockdoor.com, which covers more about Mockdoor and is being updated quite regularly. If you have any questions, you can contact us via the contact details on my Mockdoor, or you can go to the Mockdoor GitHub and raise an issue. Thank you for watching.